Slave or Daughter, The Secret Life of Olive Oatman. The Arizona sun cast violent red shadows across the desert as 14-year-old Olive Oatman studied the approaching warriors. Within hours, her life would shatter. Within 5 years, she would emerge from the wilderness bearing mysterious blue tattoos, living testament to a tale of survival that would challenge the American frontier's understanding of family and identity. Join Histories and Native Tales to uncover America's hidden frontier tales every week. Winter of 1850 gripped the Arizona Territory in its merciless embrace. A single wagon inched westward along the Gila River, carrying 9 members of the Oatman family toward an elusive paradise. Royce Oatman, a devoted Brewsterite missionary, had sacrificed everything for this journey. Following a Mormon splinter group's vision, he'd sold his farm and every possession to purchase this wagon. These provisions, this chance at reaching their promised land. The Brewsterites, breaking away from Brigham Young's mainstream Mormons, set their sights on Bishan. Named after a bountiful Middle Eastern Aegeon, it beckoned with promises of abundance. Royce and his wife Mary Ann carried not only their own dreams, but the futures of their 7 children, with an 8th growing in Mary Ann's womb. Their brood embodied Mormon traditions of large families. 14-year-old Olive, already showing signs of her mother's quiet strength. Delicate 9-year-old Mary Ann, whose gentle nature worried her parents. And 15-year-old Lorenzo, inheriting his father's stubborn determination. As their wagon wheels cut fresh tracks near modern-day Phoenix, warnings echoed from fellow travelers, warnings that fell on deaf ears. The Yavapai tribe's territory stretched before them, a landscape ravaged by famine. Winter's barren grip had stripped the land, leaving the native people desperate. Wagon trains, slow-moving and laden with supplies, presented irresistible targets. Raiders struck with increasing frequency, their attacks driven by survival rather than malice. 4 families had already turned back, unwilling to tempt fate. They'd witnessed horses vanishing in the night, shadowy figures tracking their movements. Yet Royce Oatman's confidence remained unshaken. "I understand Indians," he declared, dismissing his children's growing unease. His theory stemmed from simple observation. Violence erupted because white travelers approached natives with hostility. Show kindness, he reasoned, and kindness would follow. The theft of 2 horses from nearby camps failed to deter him. Bishan's promise loomed too close, its fertile abundance almost within reach. The remaining wagon train families pleaded for caution, begging them to wait, to travel together. They spoke of increased raids, of desperate times making desperate men, but Royce saw only the goal ahead, blind to the perils surrounding them. The morning of February 18, 1851 dawned crisp and clear. Their lone wagon traced its solitary path along the Gila River, barely 100 miles from their destination. The desert heat made daytime travel impossible, forcing them to plan a night journey. As the sun began its descent, Mary Ann Oatman stirred a meager pot of bean soup over the campfire, the aroma of fresh-baked bread mixing with desert sage as her family gathered on flat stones outside their wagon. Isolation wrapped around them like a shroud. Their previous close calls with Indian raids seemed distant memories now, yet each snap of a twig, each shadow at dusk carried potential threats. The other family's warnings echoed in the growing darkness. The Yavapai grow more desperate each day. No wagon is safe alone, but Royce's determination never wavered. His confidence in handling natives stemmed from a deep-seated belief in human kindness. Violence, he insisted, erupted only when whites approached with aggression. If they demonstrated fairness and respect, surely they would receive the same in return. Even reports of stolen horses and raided camps couldn't shake his resolve. Their provisions dwindled with each passing mile. Even travelers who had planned meticulously found themselves struggling in this barren landscape. Yet Royce pressed on, their single wagon crawling through territory that had already driven back multiple wagon trains. The dust of their former companions' retreat had long since settled, leaving them alone on this treacherous path. The family huddled closer as darkness approached, their simple meal a reminder of their dwindling supplies. Mary Ann's bean soup and fresh bread would need to sustain them through the night's journey. No one spoke of the dangers lurking in the gathering shadows. No one mentioned the growing knot of fear in their stomachs. They were too close to their destination to turn back now, or so Royce believed. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of blood and fire, its crimson fingers reaching across the desert floor like nature's final warning. The Oatman family sat in silence, unaware that these moments of peace would be their last together. 15-year-old Lorenzo's spine stiffened as dark figures materialized in the distance. The family froze mid-meal, watching silhouettes approach against the blood-red sunset. Though they carried no visible weapons, 20 warriors advanced on foot, leading 2 horses. Their lean frames cast elongated shadows across the desert floor. The warriors belonged to the Tolkapaya band of the Yavapai tribe, though newspapers would later misidentify them as Apache. Royce Oatman rose to meet them, positioning himself between the strangers and his family. Behind him, Olive and Marianne huddled closer to their mother, eyes wide with fear. Royce's Spanish greeting rang confident across the evening air. He invited the warriors to sit, offering his tobacco pipe in friendship. The gesture appeared to work. They accepted, passing the pipe between them. But their hollow cheeks and sharp eyes told a story of desperation. When they asked for food, Royce shared what little bread they had. The warriors devoured it instantly, demanding more. Royce's explanation of their own meager supplies, barely enough to reach Bishan, fell on deaf ears. The warriors pushed past him, ransacking the wagon's contents. Royce's demands for them to stop grew increasingly agitated, his theory of peaceful interaction crumbling before his eyes. For a moment, the raiders paused. They gathered in a tight circle, conversing in rapid whispers. Olive noticed their gaze shifting between the family's few cattle and the road behind them. Royce, attempting to salvage the situation, ordered his family to clean up the scattered supplies. "Let them keep what they've taken," he urged. "We'll move on quickly." The Oatmans scrambled to reorganize their belongings, hoping to distance themselves from their unwanted guests. But as they worked, the warriors concluded their hushed discussion. Hands moved beneath wool garments, withdrawing hidden war clubs. Their war cry shattered the desert silence. The attack came with devastating speed. Royce managed one step forward before a club crushed his skull. Lorenzo crumpled, blood streaming from his head wound. Mrs. Oatman fell next, still clutching her youngest child as clubs rained down. Olive turned away from the carnage, but the sounds of splintering bone and final screams would haunt her forever. Only Olive and 9-year-old Marianne remained standing when silence returned. The warriors methodically looted the wagon, gathering valuables and herding the cattle together. Then they seized the girls by their arms, forcing them northward. Following their customs, the war party quickly abandoned the massacre site, unwilling to linger for potential witnesses or reinforcements. Miles later, satisfied with their distance, the Yavapai made camp. They prepared a meal using provisions stolen from the Oatman wagon. Olive and Marianne, huddled by the fire, refusing, offered food. Marianne's body shook with convulsive sobs while Olive held her sister close, trying to provide what comfort she could. Their captors responded to their grief with threatening glares, brandishing war clubs still stained with their family's blood. The message was clear: silence or suffer the same fate. Years later, Olive would recount how Marianne's crying gradually gave way to exhausted whimpers, her small frame trembling against her older sister's protective embrace. The night stretched endless before them, desert winds carrying the scent of blood on their clothes. The fire's dancing shadows transformed their captors into monstrous silhouettes, each movement sending fresh waves of terror through the girls. They had no way of knowing that this night marked the beginning of a 5-year ordeal that would challenge every aspect of their existence, their faith, their identity, and their understanding of family itself. The first rays of dawn revealed the true brutality of their journey. 9-year-old Marianne's feet left bloody prints in the desert sand. The Yavapai had stripped both girls of their shoes, eliminating any hope of escape across the razor-sharp rocks and thorny terrain. Olive's muscles screamed with each step, but she forced herself forward, supporting her sister's increasingly unstable frame. Days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and terror. The warriors maintained a punishing pace, yanking the girls roughly whenever they faltered. Marianne's small legs trembled with fatigue, her breathing growing more labored with each passing mile. The desert sun showed no mercy, baking the earth beneath their bleeding feet. Their ordeal intensified when they encountered another warrior band. One warrior's eyes blazed with recent grief, his brother killed in battle with white settlers. He advanced toward Olive, arrow already knocked to his bow. "Blood demands blood," he snarled in his native tongue. The arrow flew, burying itself in Olive's dress inches from her heart. In that moment, Olive prayed for death. Any release, she would later write, would have been preferable to the terror of waiting for the next arrow. But their captors, perhaps remembering the trade value of undamaged prisoners, subdued the vengeful warrior. The same hands that had wielded clubs against her family now pushed her protectively behind them. The journey stretched over 60 miles northward from the massacre site, though the meandering path to avoid detection made the actual distance far greater. When they finally reached the Yavapai village, the girls' feet were nearly unrecognizable masses of torn flesh and embedded thorns. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new kind of torment. Like other war captives, Olive and Marianne were immediately put to work. From sunrise to sunset, they gathered water, foraged for food, and performed whatever tasks their captors demanded. Many tribes adopted captured children, incorporating them into their families. But the Yavapai showed no such inclination. The girls' days became an endless cycle of brutal labor and harsh punishment. Food was scarce, barely enough to keep them alive. When they failed to meet impossible expectations, beatings followed. Olive watched helplessly as Marianne's once bright spirit dimmed under the constant cruelty. Their captors seemed to take particular pleasure in breaking the younger girl's will. For 12 horrifying months, they endured this existence. Then fate intervened in an unexpected form. The Mohave tribe, who frequently traded with the Yavapai, sent a delegation to the village. Among them was Topeka, daughter of Chief Espanola. Her eyes fell upon the Oatman girls, noting their emaciated frames and haunted expressions. Topeka insisted on trading for the girls, promising them better treatment among her people. The negotiations stretched over several months, Topeka returning to consult with her father, then coming back with offers of horses, food, and blankets. The Yavapai finally agreed, perhaps seeing more value in these goods than in their increasingly frail slaves. This transaction marked a turning point in the girls' captivity, though captivity itself became an increasingly uncertain term. While the Yavapai had been unforgivable in their cruelty, slaughtering the girls' family and treating them as property, the Mohave approached them differently from the start. Topeka, daughter of Chief Espanola, worked quickly to integrate them into tribal life. Despite the language barrier, she conveyed through gestures and the few words they'd learned from the Yavapai that their lives would improve. The girls, though wary from their previous experience, found her promises surprisingly true. Chief Espanola and his wife Espanola formally adopted the girls, treating them not as slaves, but as daughters. Espanola, in particular, showed them maternal affection they'd thought forever lost. The sisters threw themselves into village life, working alongside other tribal members as equals rather than servants. As months passed, their grasp of the Mohave language grew stronger. The girls found themselves adapting to customs radically different from their Mormon upbringing. The Mohave lived close to nature, their clothing minimal and practical. During cold spells, they might don animal skin robes or ponchos, but typically men wore only loincloths while women dressed in simple skirts. This cultural shift proved challenging at first, particularly for girls raised in the modest traditions of their faith. Yet survival demanded adaptation, and gradually the strange became familiar. They learned to move comfortably through the village, as other Mohave women did, their bodies darkening under the desert sun until only the skin beneath their hair retained its original paleness. More than physical appearances changed. The girls discovered a different kind of family among the Mohave, one built on shared labor and mutual care rather than ownership and subjugation. Their days filled with the same work as other women, gathering food, preparing meals, crafting essential items for daily life. The key difference lay in how they were treated, not as property to be exploited, but as valued members of the community. On February 22, 1856, Olive emerged from this transformed existence into the worlds of Fort Yuma. The 19-year-old woman who stepped into view barely resembled the terrified 14-year-old girl who had watched her family die. Her skin had darkened to match her adoptive people's, save for the hidden patches beneath her hair. Most striking were the blue vertical lines tattooed between her mouth and chin, with additional marks running down each arm. Later, Olive would claim these tattoos marked her as a slave, but Mohave cultural practices told a different story. These sacred markings were believed to grant passage into the afterlife, a privilege reserved for family members, never slaves. This discrepancy between Olive's account and Mohave traditions raised questions that would puzzle historians for generations. Why would she deny the deeper meaning of these marks? What truths lay hidden beneath the blue lines that would forever mark her as someone caught between two worlds? The Mojave's approach to marriage revealed their first major cultural difference. Unlike the elaborate Mormon ceremonies the Oatman sisters knew, couples here simply moved in together to signify marriage. Divorce proved equally straightforward. When a union ended, one partner simply moved out. This practical approach marked just the beginning of their cultural education. A starker reality emerged during the tribe's war with the Cocopa Indians. The Mohave warriors returned victorious, bringing several prisoners back to the village. Before the sisters' eyes, they crucified one captive, a method they had learned from European Spanish missionaries. Though the girls had witnessed violence before, this calculated display showed them a different side of their adoptive tribe. The most significant change came through traditional tattooing. Both Olive and Marianne received the distinctive chin and arm markings of Mohave women. These weren't mere decorations. They served as spiritual passports, guaranteeing entrance to the Mohave afterlife. Women typically received these marks during puberty, signaling their eligibility for marriage within the tribe. Espinola, their adoptive mother, brought this ceremonial position to the girls. Olive later described the process in detail. They pricked the skin in small regular rows on our chins with a very sharp stick until they bled freely. They then dipped these same sticks in the juice of a certain weed that grew on the banks of the river, and then in the powder of a blue stone that was to be found in low water, in some places, along the bed of the stream. The stone was first burned until it would pulverize easily, and in the burning it turned nearly black, and then pricked this fine powder into the lacerated parts of the face. These markings transformed both girls into recognized women of the tribe. Though Olive would later claim these tattoos marked her as a slave, Mohave tradition suggested otherwise. Such markings traditionally granted passage to the afterlife, a privilege reserved for family members, not slaves. The Mojave's acceptance extended beyond physical marks. They treated the girls with consistent kindness, forming bonds that Olive would later acknowledge as deeply meaningful. She spoke of genuine attachment to several tribal members, a sharp contrast to their treatment by the Yavapai. The tribe gave Olive a Mohave name, Spansa. This name carried multiple possible meanings: lust, thirst, or rotten womb. While these translations hint at sexual implications, Olive maintained that the Mohave never abused her. Multiple names, even those with sexual connotations, commonly identified tribal members. As the girls adapted to Mohave life, an unknown truth waited to emerge. During the 1851 Yavapai attack that seemingly destroyed their family, one member survived. Their 15-year-old brother Lorenzo, though severely wounded, lived through the massacre. Despite his serious head injury, he managed to follow the trail until finding help. First, ironically, from a group of friendly Indians. Other pioneers soon discovered the massacre site, burying the remains of the Oatman family. Lorenzo's survival remained unknown to his sisters, who had no way to verify the attack's full toll. They continued building their new life among the Mohave, unaware that part of their old world still existed. The sisters' integration into Mohave society showed in countless ways. They learned the language, adopted tribal customs, and participated in daily life. Their former Mormon modesty adapted to Mohave practicality. During cold weather, they might wear animal skin robes or ponchos, but typically the tribe lived simply, with men wearing loincloths and women wearing only skirts. The Mojave's adoption offered stark contrast to their Yavapai captivity. Where the Yavapai had murdered their family and treated them as slaves, the Mohave provided protection and belonging. Chief Espanola and his wife Espanola took responsibility for them, treating them as daughters rather than captives. The girls worked alongside other tribal members, participating fully in community life. When pioneers discovered the massacre site, they found no trace of the Oatman sisters among the dead. Lorenzo, recovering from his wounds in a nearby settlement, knew with certainty that his sisters must have been taken captive. After healing from his head injuries, he immediately traveled to California, determined to find any trace of Olive and Marianne. But with limited education, no money, and few connections in the region, his search initially yielded no substantial leads. Despite the constant disappointments, he refused to abandon his quest. By 1854, Olive and Marianne had lived among the Mohave for over 2 years. They had become so thoroughly integrated into tribal life that they showed no desire to leave, and evidence suggests they actively resisted any suggestion of departure. That same year, United States military forces arrived in Mohave Valley, receiving a warm welcome from the tribal chiefs who displayed no signs of hiding captives. The military contingent spent 7 days in the area, meticulously surveying the land for a potential railroad route. During this extended stay, not a single soldier reported seeing or hearing about the sisters, and in all her later accounts, Olive never mentioned being hidden from these visitors. If they had wanted to escape their situation, or if life among the Mohave was unbearable, they had a clear opportunity to seek military assistance. Their choice to remain silent would soon lead to tragic consequences. In the spring of 1855, severe drought struck the region, a catastrophic event so significant that scientists can still measure its impact in tree rings today. The resulting famine gripped the Mohave tribe with devastating force. Throughout the settlement, people lay sick and dying from hunger as food supplies dwindled to nothing. The tribe's usual survival strategies proved inadequate against this unprecedented environmental disaster. Young Marianne, who had never fully adapted to the harsh desert environment, grew increasingly weak as the famine persisted. Despite the desperate efforts of Chief Espanola and Espano, along with Olive's constant care, her fragile body couldn't withstand the relentless hunger. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, matching the fate of many Mohave tribal members during this period of extreme hardship. Her death devastated the entire tribe, but particularly shattered Espano, her adoptive mother. Olive later recalled in vivid detail how Espano's grief manifested, refusing to leave Marianne's side during her final days, sobbing through endless nights. Never, Olive would write in her accounts, had I witnessed a parent more completely destroyed by the loss of a child. The depth of Espano's mourning demonstrated the genuine familial bonds that had formed during their years together. The Mohave initially planned to cremate Marianne's remains according to their traditional customs. However, when Olive requested a Christian burial for her sister, Espano took up her cause. She not only convinced Chief Espanola to permit this departure from tribal tradition, but also insisted that they wrap Marianne's body in 2 of their finest blankets, a significant gesture of respect and love from a culture that typically cremated their dead. Less than a year after Marianne's death, Mexican soldiers brought unexpected news to Fort Yuma about the Oatman girls living among the Mohave. Their detailed report specified that one sister had died, while the other remained alive just 10 days' journey from the fort. The United States military, already engaged in retrieving various captives from local tribes, took immediate interest in this information. They selected Francisco, a Quechan Indian with proven diplomatic skills, to handle the delicate mission. His tribe's friendly relations with the Mohave made him an ideal intermediary. Though not entirely certain of the surviving girl's identity, they strongly believed she must be Olive. Francisco carried an official message from Fort Yuma into Mohave territory, and word of his arrival and mission spread quickly throughout the settlement. For 3 full days, Francisco engaged in intense negotiations with Mohave chiefs, conducting most discussions without Olive's presence or input. He employed both diplomacy and pressure, warning that refusing to release her would inevitably result in American military intervention. Chief Espanola initially refused to surrender his adopted daughter, but eventually agreed to exchange her for a horse, a transaction that, while appearing to commodify her to outside observers, actually acknowledged her high value within Mohave cultural practices. Olive, facing limited options and implicit military threats, agreed to leave her adoptive home. Her impending departure triggered varied and intense reactions throughout the tribe. Espinola's son, angered by the entire situation, forbade her from taking any Mohave belongings with her, a gesture that reflected his deep resentment of her forced removal. Espano, still raw from losing Marianne, wept openly at losing another daughter. For Olive herself, leaving behind the woman who had become a second mother proved emotionally wrenching, despite the promise of reunion with her surviving blood family. Topeka, who had first brought Olive into the Mohave tribe, fittingly joined her escort back to Fort Yuma. Along with Francisco, they began the journey that would end Olive's life among the Native Americans. On February 22, 1856, after bidding farewell to Topeka, Olive stepped into Fort Yuma, closing a 5-year chapter of her life. Word of her rescue traveled hundreds of miles to reach Lorenzo. He immediately made his way to the fort, where the siblings, separated for 5 years, finally reunited. Though they barely recognized each other at first, their bond remained unbroken. Olive's story, particularly the distinctive blue tattoos marking her face, captivated newspaper readers across the country. Following their reunion, Olive and Lorenzo settled in Oregon. There, Methodist Reverend Byron Stratton, despite having no previous writing experience, offered to help them document their story. The resulting book, however, preserved little of their original accounts. Stratton's biases colored much of the narrative, while Olive herself chose to keep certain aspects of her captivity private. The published work contained numerous inaccuracies. Most notably, it misidentified their attackers as Apache rather than Yavapai, a common error of the time, as Apaches were blamed for most frontier violence. The book also presented incorrect dates, exaggerated distances between locations, and scrambled the chronological order of events. Significantly, it portrayed Olive's tattoos as marks of slavery, contradicting Mohave cultural practices. These distortions, whether introduced by Stratton or intentionally maintained by Olive, made the story more palatable to contemporary readers. The narrative emphasized Olive's unwilling captivity and preserved virtue, suggesting she had been kept as a slave, a status that would have protected her from certain cultural practices among the Mohave. Olive traveled extensively to promote the book, delivering public lectures, a remarkable achievement for a woman of her time when female public speaking was considered improper. Despite its flaws, or perhaps because they aligned with public expectations, the book sold well. Alternative accounts emerged over time. Lieutenant Emil Weiss Whipple, part of the 1854 railroad expedition through Mohave Valley, recorded that while he never saw Olive or Marianne, Mohave customs dictated that married women received blue vertical line tattoos on their chins. This detail sparked speculation about Olive's true status within the tribe. Rumors circulated that she had married into the tribe, possibly to Espinola's son, and bore children. This would explain his intense anger at her departure and his refusal to let her take any tribal possessions. Unverified reports in subsequent decades told of half-white children among the Mohave, with some allegedly visiting Fort Yuma. Susan Thompson, claiming friendship with Olive, later stated that Olive had privately expressed grief over missing her children. However, Thompson's credibility remained questionable, as she had been caught in other falsehoods. The true nature of Olive's relationship with the Mohave, particularly regarding marriage and children, remains unclear in historical records. The complexity of Olive's story, with its contradictions and carefully maintained ambiguities, speaks to the challenges faced by captives who crossed cultural boundaries. The public wanted a simple narrative of survival and virtue maintained, while the reality likely involved deeper connections and more complex relationships within the Mohave community that had become her second family. Olive's deeper connection to the Mohave tribe surfaced in 1864 when she learned of their delegation visiting New York. Hoping to see Espinola among them, she rushed to meet the group, only to discover he had passed away. Still, she greeted the Mohave visitors with warmth, noting in her writings how the left-handed gesture remained their sacred tribal pledge. Through these visitors, she learned that Topeka longed for her return, hoping her adopted sister would grow weary of life among the white settlers. This reunion would never materialize. In 1865, Olive married John Fairchild, finding common ground in their experiences with Native Americans. His brother had been killed by Apaches. Their marriage brought wealth and reported happiness, though Olive struggled with physical health issues and probable depression. During these years, she gradually distanced herself from her Mohave past, covering the fading tattoos she had once displayed during lectures. Her husband influenced this shift, forbidding discussion of her captivity and systematically destroying every copy of Stratton's book he could find, apparently viewing them as sources of embarrassment. Olive Oatman died in 1903, carrying with her many unanswered questions about her time among the Native Americans. The true nature of her relationships, experiences, and feelings remains sealed in history, leaving behind a story that challenges our understanding of identity, belonging, and survival on the American frontier. Join us at Histories and Native Tales as we uncover the hidden truths of America's past. Each story reveals something profound about who we were and who we've become. Subscribe now to explore more fascinating tales of cultural collision and human perseverance.